Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, June 24th, 2024, and I'm the host of the show, Dr. Cara Santa Maria. And as always, before we dive into this week's episode, I do want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible. Remember, Talk Nerdy is and will always be 100% free to download. And the way we keep this thing going is mostly by relying on listener support from folks just like you. If you're interested in pledging your support on an episodic basis for the show, all you've got to do is visit patreon.com/talknerdy. This week's top patrons include Anu Bharavaj, Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Mary Neva, Brian Holden, David Compton, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo, Joe Wilkinson, Pasquale Gelati, and Ulrika Hagman. Thank you all so much. All right, let's get into it. So this week I got to reconnect with an old friend. We go way, way back to the Science Online days. His name is Ferris Jabr, and he's a contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine, as well as Scientific American, and has written for The New Yorker, Harper's, The Atlantic, National Geographic, more outlets than you can count. He's the recipient of a Whiting Foundation Creative Nonfiction Grant and fellowships from both UC Berkeley and MIT, and he has a brand new book out. It's called Becoming Earth: How Our Planet Came to Life. So without any further ado, here he is, science writer Ferris Jabr. Well, Ferris, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. No, it's wonderful to be here.
It's been a really long time since I last saw you. Would it have been at Science Online, which was this kind of science writing and science communicating conference we used to both attend, or do you think I've seen you since then?
It was in that era, or it might have been in New York when you visited the Scientific American offices, and yeah, something around that time.
Yeah, so that would have been at least a decade ago.
Right.
That's nuts. Okay, so obviously we are here today to talk about your new book, but before we get into your new book, I would love to hear about what you've been up to in that amount of time. You've been continuing to write and really build out your career as a science writer, and I'm seeing so many different publications. Are you still working mostly freelance, or do you have any staff positions anywhere?
So after a few years at Scientific American, I decided to go full-time freelance so I could really focus full-time on writing. So that's what I've been doing since then. I think that was 2014 that I made that transition. And also about a year later, I decided to move back to the West Coast. I grew up in California. And I've now been living in Portland, Oregon since about 2015. And I've mostly been writing magazine-wise for the New York Times Magazine, where I became a contributing writer. And so, I do sort of long-form features and profiles for them about nature and science, but I've also freelanced as well for The Atlantic, National Geographic, The New Yorker, Harper's, various other publications. And yeah, basically writing broadly within the life sciences, earth sciences, the environment.
And so you came to science writing and science journalism through the sort of journalism track, right? Like I often see with science writers that it's not a perfect binary, but that there's this core group of people who were scientists who decided to learn to write. And then there's this core group of people who were writers who decided to learn science. Where do you think you fall in that continuum?
Right. So I'm one of the more hybrid people where, I loved both reading and writing and nature and science from a very young age. But I didn't know any professional writers growing up. And to me, making a living through writing always seemed like this, dream on the distant horizon, not an actual feasible reality or possibility. And so I thought in undergrad that I would go down the scientific research route and maybe I would write on the side as a hobby or something like that. But by the time I graduated, I decided I did not want to stay in academia for various reasons. And I'd kind of stumbled into the larger world of science communication. The PBS show Nova was filmed not too far from where I went to college, and I did an internship with them. And kind of opened my eyes to this world of people that love science and learn about science and communicate it to the public, but don't actually do the day-to-day work of scientific research. And so that to me seemed like the perfect fusion of my interests and an actual feasible way to make a living potentially. So I decided to pursue that and see how it went.
I love it. And of course, your sort of beat is not terribly narrow. Like you write about a lot of different topics, don't you?
Yeah, I'm definitely more of a generalist than a specialist. I mean, if it involves, living things or the planet, I'm probably interested. So I've written about everything from, neuroscience and health to human evolution and genetics to, basic fundamental biology and ecology. Don't so much stray into things like, astronomy, astrophysics, hard chemistry, math, but generally, broadly within the more life sciences, I've written a lot about a lot of different subjects within that realm.
And then it's interesting when those things do, cross paths because I think I feel the same way, but and granted, I don't write much, but I do a lot of psychom, and I've tended towards like I guess human behavior a little bit more, even though I'm still very interested in the life sciences. Um, Physics, astronomy, those kinds of things are just it's a different level of expertise that I don't have and my interest isn't as deep there, but it is always really interesting when you're talking about something where you have to kind of bone up on your physics or on your
Mm-hmm.
chemistry, like, and especially when you're talking about life, those
Mm-hmm.
things are fundamental.
Absolutely. I mean, thermodynamics and how energy and matter work and, with each other and organic chemistry and all of that is underlying, the phenomenon we refer to as life. So, and I think that's actually, it's actually interesting to look through the history of science and to see how different scientists from different fields have approached that question of what really is life, using their own perspectives. And engineers and physicists tend to have a different way of looking at it than scientists who have been fully immersed in just evolutionary biology or genetics do.
Would you say that that sort of curiosity, that grappling was one of the motivations or one of the inspirations for writing this book? Because it's a pretty big topic. And so I'm curious how you decided, yeah, I can I can cover that topic in a book.
Yeah, the scope is quite ambitious, quite wide, and I do think that interest in the fundamental nature and definition of life, which has been a long running interest for me, is definitely one of the threads, one of the undercurrents feeding into this project. Because to me, life is the single most fascinating phenomenon that we know of. And obviously it has captivated all kinds of scientists for millennia. And yet we still don't have a consensus definition of life. You open a textbook and you get these long lists of supposed criteria that distinguish the animate from the inanimate, but not a beautiful, elegant, simplified sentence that can just define what life is as a fundamental phenomenon. We're still trying to figure that out, and we don't have that robust scientific framework to really explain what we mean by life. So, I think that creates a really interesting intellectual space because it's not, in some ways, it's not the kind of question that can be easily or definitively answered just by finding the right expert or the right source, right? It's almost,
Mhm.
it's like it's between science and philosophy because nobody actually knows yet. So we're all still trying to figure it out.
It's also, like, deeply reflective of cultural values, like, it's so funny because I think it was last night or maybe the night before, I'm a bit of a documentary fanatic, and so I watch probably, like, a documentary a day if I have time. I don't always have time, but, recently I watched I think it was called The Lakota Nation versus the United States, which is visually stunning and really compelling story of kind of the long history of colonialism in the U.S. and kind of how it's continues to impact indigenous cultures. And obviously, one of the threads, one of the themes that you often see is that, like, Earth is alive. Like, we are existing in a system. And if you kill things and if you extract things, you are actually harming a living, breathing, interconnected life, not just some sort of like terra forma that then living things stand on top of.
Hmm. Right, exactly. So this fundamental concept of the world being alive, of Earth being a living entity, is ancient, and it is one of those ideas that is almost ubiquitous. We see it in so many different world religions and mythologies, and I think for many indigenous cultures, and probably for our human ancestors going back into deep human evolutionary time, it was just sort of assumed. It was just sort of a basic precept about the world that, of course, everything around us, was alive as well.
Right. It was moving, it was doing stuff. So it felt alive.
Exactly. Yeah. It's so everything is so dynamic and interconnected. So why wouldn't it be?
But then, of course, we have more recent evidence that maybe we've been onto something all this time.
Right. So if we look at the history of science, we see that in really early Western science, the idea of planets being animate, of Earth being alive, is still accepted. And then as time goes on, and as things get more reductionist, more empirical, that very much falls out of favor. And there is this increasing attention on splitting the animate from the inanimate, and viewing the Earth as an inanimate body of resources that can be exploited and used to our benefit. And we are members of the animate class. We inhabit
Right.
this inanimate body. And obviously, so much, politics and culture and war and conquest all comes in to kind of favor that worldview. And that has been the dominant thinking, within mainstream Western science for a long time. There have, of course, been some famous figures that we can talk about that have, tried to oppose that, and were often, roundly critiqued and even ridiculed for doing so.
A bit sort of in, I don't want to say ahead of their time, like behind their time and then ahead of their time at the same time. So they're just in the
Yeah.
wrong time for the zeitgeist of science to look at them seriously, unfortunately. And I think that's such a beautiful example. I work very often in the sort of scientific skeptic community doing a lot of advocacy. And I think one of the pitfalls that I see within the scientific skeptic community is this tendency towards logical positivism, this tendency towards very, very staunch reductionistic thought. And that's such a beautiful example of the alternative view, which is that, yes, science is always adapting and adjusting and somewhat self kind of regulating, but science is a system that is used by people. And it is the people's biases and the people's culture bound perspectives that massively influences not just the way that science is done, but the kinds of questions we want to ask and how we interpret the results.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's interesting because in some ways, science, and especially, modern experimental science, is an attempt to become, as inhuman as possible, right? To divorce ourselves from all these biases and prejudices as much as possible. And yet it is still a product of humanity, and it is still conducted by people. And so, it is impossible to fully escape our internal biases and prejudices and flaws, even though that is kind of the illusion, right? Is that here's this amazing technique that we can use to understand the world without those things.
Yeah, we're often trying to convince ourselves that that's the case,
Right.
but you're right. It is a bit of an illusion. And I feel like I'm glad we got that out of the way at the beginning, because that's like almost an important foundational, I guess, axiom, or I don't know, self-reflection that is important when we start to talk about these kinds of things, because they are very zeitgeist specific. And right now we're moving into a sort of new era. So, the book that you wrote, it's called Becoming Earth: How Our Planet Came to Life. And of course, there are a lot of stories in this book about these kind of fundamental changes, these fundamental shifts. And we'll get a little bit into like what happened billions of years ago. But we kind of have just been touching on one of the foundational themes of the book, which is this concept, I guess, there's a name for it now, right? Of uh, what's this new field? Earth system science. Can you
Right.
tell us a little bit
Yeah.
about that?
Right. So Earth system science is a comparatively young field, if we're comparing it to biology and chemistry and physics, but it is well established at this point. And the whole idea is to take a much more holistic, integrated approach to look at what has traditionally been considered, the inanimate planet, all the geology, and then all the living components, all of the life on the planet, as a single integrated system that cannot be separated and is best understood as a whole. So to look at how biology and geology have changed each other through time, how intimately intertwined they are, and just to try and understand the Earth as a single interconnected system, not as a planet that is then inhabited by life, but rather as a living planet, as some scientists have come to call it.
Yeah, it's almost, I mean, maybe this is not a good characterization, but from a sort of lay perspective, I feel like it's almost like ecology expanded, because I do feel like the field of ecology very much is founded on this concept of interconnectivity. And, this one thing changes and all these other things change. They're all deeply related. But it's sort of taking that concept of plants and animals and extending it to environmental phenomena, extending it to geology, extending it to all of the ways that these systems are sort of stochastic and plastic and always changing.
I absolutely agree. I think there's been this growing recognition in recent decades that, for example, all biology is by necessity ecology. Like any individual complex multicellular creature is in effect its own ecosystem and can only be understood in those terms. And I think the difference now is it's really a matter of scale, like you were saying. Like, even Rachel Carson, one of our greatest ecological thinkers ever, she wrote that, that life's influence on the planet as a whole was very slight, because that was the thinking, back in the 50s and 60s. Now we know that's completely untrue, that life has profoundly changed the planet. And it's just a matter, it's in part a matter of scale. It's, understanding that life is not just changing its environment locally, it's changing its environment on the scale of a continent, the ocean, the atmosphere, or indeed the entire planet.
Yeah. So I was hoping that you would maybe take us back a little while. And the funny thing is, I'm having to catch myself in how I even frame this question, because I wanted to say, take us back to before there was life. But then I was like, we're sort of radically redefining life here. So maybe take us back to the time before what we think of as organism life, what we think of as the simplest kind of creatures, maybe back to the building blocks of life. Like, what did our planet look like? What was going on way, way back, millions of years ago?
Yeah, and I think your original framing is apt, because I do think that in the planet's birth, in its earliest chapters, it was a purely inanimate entity. It was really just this seething ball of rock and lava and early oceans and early atmospheres forming. And not only were there no living organisms, there wasn't really any phenomenon that we would call life at that time. And so, back then, this would be, 4.5 billion years ago, somewhere between 4 and 4.5 billion years ago. Um, the atmosphere was probably orange and hazy and full of methane and carbon. There were no nothing we would recognize as actual, continental land masses. The oceans were probably just beginning to form and very shallow. There may have been some, scattered volcanic islands here and there. It took a while for Earth to develop a stable atmosphere. There may have been torrential rains in the very beginning. It was basically, if one were to see early Earth from space, you would not recognize it as Earth. It was just too different.
It's fascinating to think too that you mentioned you actually use the word inanimate, which is so apropos of what we've been talking about.
Yeah.
It's because yes, from a perspective of animation requiring life, it was inanimate, but from the perspective of animation meaning volatile and full of movement, it sounds like it was a really volatile place and there was a lot going on then.
Oh yeah, it's the birth of our planet was incredibly violent, and it's always been an extremely dynamic system. That's never changed or stopped. So yeah, I mean purely in the sense of life as a biological phenomenon.
So I'm super curious then and I know that obviously there are sort of conflicting theories about this, but you've dug quite deep and done a lot of good research and a lot of good reporting to try to uncover where the sort of scientific perspective is or where the controversy lies with regard to that tip, that change, that sort of, we might call it abiogenesis, that thing that happened, or maybe it was a lot of things that had to happen for either early life to occur or the things that would then become life to occur. So what did that sort of look like, or at least what do we think we know about that right now?
Right. So when I was taking on this book project, I knew from the beginning that I didn't really want to retell the history of life on Earth, because that's been done so many times, and we've all heard about, the RNA world hypothesis and, how did these little bits and molecules come together and form the first protocells and all of that. And, rather I wanted to focus on how the planet came to life and how life profoundly altered the planet through time. And so to be honest, I don't spend like a huge number of pages going into detail, kind of rehearsing the initial origins of life, as is typically told. But basically, the way I've come to think about it is that bits of Earth itself, bits of the planet rearrange themselves into the first proteins and molecules and genetic molecules and cells. And those evolved into what we would recognize as microorganisms. These were the earliest and smallest and most ancient forms of life that arose on the planet. And I think, the older view might be that, life is something that is happening on Earth as opposed to parcels of Earth coming together and rearranging themselves and becoming life. And I think that is the beginning of what for me has been the single biggest revelation, perhaps, in writing this book, which is that I think we have to stop thinking of life as something that resides on the planet or inhabits the planet and start to see life as literally a physical extension of the planet, an expression of the planet. And I like to make the analogy to a vast beach. So if you imagine a beach from which sand castles and intricate sand sculptures spontaneously emerge, these sculptures are not suddenly divorced from the rest of the beach just because they've attained a higher level of complexity and organization. They're still made of the same particles of sand that surrounds them. They're still literally part of the beach. And I think it's the same way with life and Earth. So life emerged from Earth, literally, is made of Earth, returns to Earth. It is an extension of Earth.
I love that. And it's funny. Try to stay with me on this because it's a half-baked idea that is just coming to my mind right now. But I'm often trying to connect things to metaphor, to analogy that exist in my mind. And of course, being a psychologist, I'm really, fascinated by the philosophy of psychology and the philosophy of the mind. And there's, this kind of long debate about monism versus dualism. Most modern neuroscientists are monists, and sort of this description that's often used is that the mind is an emergent property of the brain. There is no mind without brain. It's not an entity that acts on the brain. It is brain, yet it is somehow measured differently than brain. And so, and this concept of the emergent property, which is a very philosophical concept to try and describe a very physical thing. I can't help but see a parallel there, that life is an emergent property of Earth.
Oh, absolutely. I think there's huge resonance between those ideas. And I think, most mainstream scientists accept that life is a material phenomenon, but we just are not yet able to fully explain it, right? So it's something is happening. When matter and energy interact in this way, the phenomenon we call life emerges from those interactions. So it is this emergent level, and we're still trying to figure out what exactly causes that. Very similar to consciousness, right? The way we talk about it, like you're saying, is that somehow this incredible tangle of neurons and all the connections between them and having that many nodes interconnected results in this emergent phenomenon of consciousness.
Yeah. And it is interesting that there's even parallels there with kind of the measurement difficulty. I think the one place where my analogy breaks down is that it may be the case that consciousness, it's not a measurable thing. We can only measure it by proxy, by neuronal activity. Whereas we can physically like poke things that are alive, we can interrogate them in the lab in a way that it's harder to do with the phenomenon that is mind or consciousness. But it's cool to think about it in these more, I think, philosophical terms, because I think it's also a good exercise in I don't know, neuropsychological humility. It's an exercise in scientific exploration, allowing the complexity of thought on these ideas. I think it can be very expansive for us to think in this way. And it's a very creative way to think without in any way rejecting, denying, or minimizing the value and the necessity of kind of hard science and hard metrics within science.
Absolutely.
So I'm curious what you did decide, or how, I guess maybe before we get to the what, let's talk about the how. Based on that sort of change in your thinking, that big paradigm shift in your thinking, which underlies this project of describing our planet coming to life. How did you choose to organize your thoughts when you went to lay this out on paper?
Right. So structuring this, I think structuring any nonfiction book that isn't based on a single central character or has like a straight, narrative through line is always quite challenging. And it was particularly so in this case. If there is a central character in this book, I would say that it's Earth, that it's the living planet itself. And that's kind of, the main story we're following. But because I didn't want to do a straight, linear chronology. And I also wanted to give a sense of rhythm and waves and sort of feedback cycles, because those are so fundamental to the Earth system and how it operates. I decided to use a 3-part structure in which we kind of trace a similar arc within each of those 3 sections. So the book is divided into rock, water, and air to reflect the 3 main spheres of the planet, the lithosphere, the hydrosphere, and the atmosphere. And also, the 3 main elements, material elements that compose the planet. And within each of those sections, there are 3 chapters that trace this evolutionary arc. So the first chapter begins with the earliest and smallest organisms, the microbes, and how they changed that layer of the planet. Then the second section looks at later, more complex organisms like animal, plants, and fungi. And the third and final chapter in each section looks at what our species has done most recently in the past few centuries.
So you do have a significant focus, which I love, because I think sometimes we try to think about geologic time, and we are but a blip in geologic time, but sometimes it's not just about the chronology, it's about the impact. And even though we are but a blip, goodness, have we changed the fundamental nature of our planet in a way that almost, maybe I shouldn't say no organisms did in the past, because like you said, when we first had microbes, things changed a lot. But there is something kind of impactful in a really, really, I can't even find the right word, like magnificent and devastating way that happened when human beings started to geoengineer, started to industrialize, started to, utilize agriculture, all of these different things. So we'll get to that, but let's go back to how those microbes started, changing things so much.
Right. So I think if we had to choose probably the single most profound transformation caused by life, so first of all, microbes are, they're responsible for some of the most fundamental transformations, and they continue to be the foundation of all ecosystems. And when Earth goes through its cataclysms, it often shrinks down to microbial type life, and then everything kind of resprings from there. So microbes are why we have a breathable atmosphere, a blue sky, fire, high mineral diversity, fertile soils. I mean, they really kicked it all off. So it all started with cyanobacteria in the oceans about 2.5 billion years ago, when cyanobacteria innovated oxygenic photosynthesis. So they're taking common resources, sunlight, water, carbon dioxide, performing photosynthesis, and releasing oxygen as a byproduct. They initiated this very long process of oxygenating Earth's atmosphere. Now, that took a really long time. I think it took close to 2 billion years to really complete that process. But it completely changed everything about the planet, because it went from an environment in which there was essentially no free oxygen in the atmosphere whatsoever to an oxygen-rich environment, a highly oxidizing environment. So now you have an atmosphere and oceans that are much more suffused with free oxygen, with O2, than they were before. You have all kinds of chemical reactions going on that were impossible before. You have new minerals forming. Fire is only possible in a high oxygen environment, which did not exist before life oxygenated the environment. Without fire, human evolution would not have been what it was. So it just creates this incredible chain of consequences. It's even possible that the emergence of complex multicellular life was either dependent upon or dramatically accelerated by this oxygen-rich environment, because once organisms learn to take in oxygen and use that for their metabolism, they take that up to a new notch and they become more energy efficient, and that allows them to get bigger and more complex. So that the oxygenation of Earth, begun by cyanobacteria, later continued by algae and land plants, is probably the single most profound way in which life changed the planet.
And there's something kind of interesting when I think about cyanobacteria, this kind of we sometimes call it blue-green algae.
Mm-hmm.
So when I think about this organism, this very simple, very primitive, early organism that had such a dramatic effect on all of these different systems of the planet, I think something that's curious is that often when we think about evolution and life, the way that life changes, we like to categorize things. We like to think about low complexity to high complexity, which doesn't always hold, or we try to, we're always trying to put things into buckets, right? And make these different constructs. But one thing that's striking to me is that cyanobacteria has always been and continues to be. It's not like certain other life forms where we see this growth and change, and then those, I guess, earlier forms are no longer adaptive and they die off. And that's what's really curious to me. And I'm sure that, maybe I'm not sure, maybe you can tell me, genetically are the ones we have today the same as the ones from billions of years ago? Are they very, very highly conserved? But the fact that these basic things continue to have a niche and continue to be so fundamental on our planet is fascinating.
Absolutely. And so this gets to the whole idea of a living fossil, right? An organism or a species that is so similar through geologic time that it's almost as though it had never changed. And so my understanding is that, there are indeed species that retain their fundamental characteristics for inconceivably long times, because at that, natural selection has already hit upon a system that works so well for that species and their environment, that it's not coming across any new changes that are advantageous enough to merit being proliferated. My understanding is that genetically, evolution never stops, so that the genomes of modern cyanobacteria are different from the ancient ones, but not nearly as different, as say a species that has gone through much more dramatic adaptation or evolution. And it is like, I guess we can think of these species as kind of the longest branches on the tree of life. Like, these are the most
Right.
unbroken branches that go like as far back as we can trace them. Whereas others have, ended a long time ago, and that's just been the end of their line completely. And others have, morphed and diverged in much more complex ways. And so there's some lineage today that we can trace back, but their ancient forms are very different from what they are now. And then there's things like alligators and crocodiles that have, basically that body plan and lifestyle has evolved many times and kind of been lost and re-evolved. And it's
Yeah.
similar, with trees. Like, trees are not a closely related group of plants taxonomically or familially. It's a lifestyle choice that plants come upon, and that has evolved many times. Like, some of the first trees were actually ferns that grew to the size of trees. Like, if you've ever seen a modern tree fern, like basically any plant that gets tall enough and branches, and builds up enough woody mass is thought of as a tree. So there are these lifestyles and ecological approaches that just are extremely successful, and they've stayed around for a really long time, or if they've been lost, they've come back.
Yeah, I love thinking of that as a lifestyle choice. It's such a good conceptualization. I think it really like clicks it into clear view. And I can't help but think about this, this concept like we were talking about of like long evolutionary time, certain things being more conserved, other things changing rapidly and almost not even being recognizable compared to their earlier ancestors. I can't help but think about this other quirk that has occurred in life wherein organisms actually engulfed other organisms and became a part of themselves. So it's not just now about these different branches of evolution, but this endosymbiosis. And like we could not exist without having consumed certain types of bacteria and actually utilizing them within our own body cells. Like that's fascinating.
I agree. I think about that all the time, that we are all composite creatures. We are this hodgepodge of the animal and the microbial. And, like you're saying, so like every modern plant is the descendant of this primordial fusion, in which an ancient ocean-dwelling microbe engulfed, subsumed a cyanobacteria, which eventually became chloroplasts in plant cells, as well as the bacteria that eventually became mitochondria. And then we animals just have the mitochondria part of that. And then our genomes, as multicellular animals, our genomes are riddled with genetic information from various microbes and viruses, a large percentage of our genomes, in fact. And then horizontal gene transfer, we know, now occurs not just between bacteria, which are known to be very genetically promiscuous and able to exchange genetic information all the time, but also across different species and even kingdoms of life. So you have plants and insects and microbes trading genes in unexpected ways. And that has all required, that's been one of the substantial updates to kind of modern evolutionary theory, is that we now have to add all these cross-links between the trees, between the branches on the trees of life. Or I like to think of it as a mischievous wind that is blowing pollen from one branch and one flower to another in kind of unpredictable, whimsical ways. And we have to kind of go back and reverse engineer all the connections.
Oh, it's so complicated, but in the most delicious way. And and it's like it's interesting too to think about, this, like we were talking about, this sort of complexity of uh, I become you and you become me, and this organism has these bits and pieces in both its cellular anatomy and also its DNA from these other organisms. But you mentioned when you were talking about a lot of this horizontal gene transfer and this sort of sharing of genetic information, not just bacteria, but you mentioned viruses. And of course, we can't talk about life without talking about viruses. And
Right.
so I'm curious how you grapple with this question, kind of going back to that earliest conversation we had about like what is alive and how do we define it? Because viruses are pesky, aren't they? They are complicated.
Yeah, their viruses are probably one of the more famous, thorns in this whole business of trying to define life. And probably like it is divisive amongst mainstream scientists, but I think there's a pretty significant contingent of scientists who think that viruses are either alive or they're at the threshold of life,
Mhm.
because so for me it's difficult to exclude viruses from the realm of life because I don't see how on a fundamental level they are really that different from a multicellular parasite that is also completely dependent on its host to
Right.
survive or reproduce. And so some people will say, well, but a multicellular parasite, a parasitic worm it's made of many different cells, like it has its own metabolism and such. True, but if you remove it from the right environment, it's completely useless and it's completely
Yeah,
dead.
and
And
it
and
will
that's
die. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
So how is that? How is that really fundamentally different from a virus needing a cell environment, to replicate itself? So I think viruses qualify. I guess. Yeah. I mean, I've come to think of the defining quality of life as this capacity to sustain oneself, to actively sustain oneself. So, thermodynamics dictates that everything is heading towards this homogeneous mush, right? It's all going to dissolve into this homogeneous mush, and nothing can escape that fate in the end. But what we call life are systems that temporarily evade that fate by actively using free energy to reduce their internal entropy and maintain what would otherwise be an incredibly improbable high level of organization and complexity. And so viruses are doing that. They're just hijacking another system to accomplish it. But really, all living things are dependent on other systems around them, to remain alive. Like there is no such thing as an organism that isn't dependent on its environment in some way. So I don't really see them as unique in that sense.
Yeah, it's interesting that there is like how do we even define that sort of cognitive threshold or that cognitive stopping point that we often have, and it's almost a feeling more than a thought. Like, yeah, but a virus, sure, thinking about, okay, virus versus parasitic worm, for example. And yes, the worm has a digestive tract and the worm has maybe like some sort of nuclei where like it can, experience sensations and, can be reactive to the outside world. And how the hell does a virus do that with like nothing? Like it's so fundamentally basic. It's got like some sugar, it's got like a little bit of like really basic nucleic acid, and yet it's able to continue to replicate and to break on in there and to fuck stuff up. And it's like, I think the part that is like fundamentally freaky about viruses is the fact that they can exist.
Yeah, I mean, it in some ways it makes me think also of crystals. Like so,
Mm-hmm.
crystals are able to grow. Like you can grow a crystal at home, and they will faithfully replicate these fairly complex, very orderly structures. That's what defines a crystal is just how orderly its structure is. And I
Yes.
think of ice. Like we've all seen snowflakes under a microscope. I mean, isn't there something so incredibly organic feeling about the intricacy of a snowflake, seen at that
Yeah.
resolution? And that's exactly what ice crystals do as well. Is like if an ice crystal gets, if an ice crystal is in the right environment, it's going to create a chain reaction of ice crystals, through that liquid environment. So there are these fundamental processes, occurring below the threshold of what we typically consider life that very strongly resemble what we could call some of the simplest living entities are doing. And there's prions, right, or even simpler than viruses, and
Right.
they manage to replicate themselves as well, quite powerfully.
Ugh,
So.
prions. Oh man. Fascinating. So okay, I want to make sure that we're sort of jumping back into like this structure that you developed. So we talked about microbial, very, very early microbial life, and sort of the intense, probably the largest, most dramatic shift of Earth coming from that change. And so what's next? What is the next kind of big shift, and how did that occur?
So one of the things I keep having to remind myself of when I was writing this book is that for the vast majority of Earth's history, it was a purely microbial planet. For
Mhm.
multiple billions of years, it was purely microbes. And complex multicellular life is such a comparatively recent introduction. So we don't even get to the complex multicellular life like animals and fungi and plants until, let's say, roughly 500 million years ago. And so between cyanobacteria kicking off the oxygenation of Earth and 500 million years ago, microbes continue to do a lot of interesting things to ocean chemistry. Different types of microbes may have dyed parts of the ocean red or pink or white, just depending on whatever chemical reactions were going on in their bodies and what kind of byproducts they were releasing. But the major change was the one we talked about, was the oxygenation of the ocean and the atmosphere. And then you get this explosion of complex multicellular life. Then there's a really interesting event called the Cambrian substrate revolution. So many people have heard of the Cambrian explosion, which is when all of these incredible early animal forms, came onto the scene, and they had a lot of interesting exoskeletons and claws and teeth, and they were kind of evolving complex prey-predator relationships for the first time. But an interesting side story to that is that as a result of these new adaptations, many of these creatures started to very dramatically disturb the sea floor. So early on, the sea floor was kind of covered by this thick microbial mat, and these weird ediacaran life forms that they're so bizarre, we don't even know if they were animals or fungi or something else. They would kind of move along these microbial mats, grazing on them. There are these weird sessile fern-like things, waving in the currents attached to these mats. So then the Cambrian animals come in and they start tearing all these mats up, digging into them to hide themselves, digging into them to forage and find prey. And scientists have compared that to what settlers did to the prairies when they came through and kind of tore them all up and converted them to farmland. And so
Oh,
these
the Dust Bowl. We had a big Dust Bowl coming, huh?
Yes. So it was in some ways, it was devastating for the former Ediacaran life forms that depended on this, very sedate, closed in environment. But ultimately, it made the ocean much more habitable because it irrigated all of these layers of seafloor sediments. And scientists have compared that irrigation to a system of veins and arteries. So it opened all these oxygen and water rich channels, created, new layers of niches that new species could evolve to occupy. And now these kinds of microbial mats are quite rare. They only exist in very, oxygen poor environments. And most of the seafloor is, much more layered and diverse and inhabited than it ever used to be before the advent of these Cambrian animals. So that's a very powerful example of how a evolutionary biological change can result in a geological change, which can then loop back to influence evolution, which happens again and again.
Yeah, I was going to say even this very simple organization, right, of like rock, water, and air sort of breaks down here,
Oh,
because where
yeah.
does the water end and the rock begin?
Exactly. Yeah, it's all so interconnected, it's almost impossible to neatly separate it.
Yeah. I love it. And then, of course, I mean, I'm going to skip a lot in between. Like we're like, okay, we've got this explosion, and then we get on the scene at some point
Right.
eventually, and obviously, a lot of things happen in between. But I don't want this to be. I do want this to be like a 3-hour podcast, but I'm not going to make this a 3-hour podcast. So I'm curious, is there, obviously there's a million things that we could be talking about, but in the form, in the way that you kept your organizational structure, um, how much do you get into the in between this massive microbial change and this explosion into these kind of little, I don't know, animalcules, before you start to talk about the massive change that again happens, like bookending this story, at least as far as we know it today, which is the Anthropocene? Are there a lot of dynamic changes between this sort of Cambrian era and the Anthropocene era that are as massive?
Well, one of the things that writing this book allowed me to do was to better
Hmm.
visualize these incredible evolutionary arcs.
Yeah.
There's one that I think is particularly relevant to your question that I did not properly understand before kind of taking this Earth system science approach. So,
Okay.
cyanobacteria kick off the oxygenation of Earth, and then that is later continued by land plants more like 400 something million years ago. With the advent of land plants and the spread of forests, they brought the level of oxygen up to its current level and even pushed it beyond, so that in the Carboniferous, you had maybe, today we have 21% oxygen, it was maybe 30 to 35% oxygen. And this
Oh,
was the
wow.
period of time when you had massive insects and arthropods. Like you had dragonflies that were at least the size of pigeons, if not larger. And you had,
Ugh.
I know, and you had like millipedes the size of surfboards. So they were all bathed in this, incredibly oxygen rich environment. And it was also an extremely flammable environment because it was so oxygen rich. So there was a lot of raging wildfires, far more intense than what we see today. And this period is called the Carboniferous because this is when a lot of Earth's coal deposits formed. And
Right. So
so
these are a lot of the fossil fuels we're still using today.
exactly. So this like helps
Okay.
us better understand where fossil fuels come from. So, fossil fuels are called fossil fuels because they are literally made of the remains of ancient life that have been compacted and cooked deep within the earth. So, coal is mostly terrestrial plant matter that was, got buried in swamps and compacted and cooked. And then oil, gas is mostly plankton and, photosynthetic ocean life that was buried on the seafloor and got compacted and cooked. And I'm going to forget the exact numbers now, but Vaclav Smil, this environmental scientist and analyst, has shown that, even a mere gallon of gasoline is equivalent to some ridiculous amount of living matter. I think
Uh,
it's like, it's like 20 elephants or something, let's say,
yeah,
worth of
we
living
never even
matter.
think about that. I mean, obviously, because it is one of the richest, most dense energy sources where like this is, going back to this idea of everything being interconnected in the most profound way. This is death that was compounded, and now we're extracting that death and utilizing it as a form of energy. Um, of course it's going to be something like 20 elephants or whatever the number may be, because it's such a rich source of energy and we utilize it like without a thought.
Exactly. I mean, it is extravagant. It's ludicrously extravagant. I call fossil fuels, ecosystems in an urn. Like you're
Yeah.
saying. Yeah, it is. It's literally these condensed cemeteries of ancient life and all of the ancient sunlight that they have harnessed and that we are now unburying and unleashing. And so when when you properly realize that that is what we are doing, that we are going into the earth and we are unburying all of this ancient life that is meant to be sequestered. And I say meant to be in the sense that that is how the carbon cycle has worked for so long, is that the planet's climate is largely dictated by where carbon is stored and how it is moving through the various reservoirs of carbon in the Earth system. When there's excess carbon in the atmosphere, the planet heats up. When there's excess carbon sequestered in the crust and the deep ocean, the planet cools down. And we have come along and unburied huge amounts of carbon and released it to the atmosphere, causing this incredibly rapid change. And going back to your point earlier, I do think it is possible that our species is moving more carbon to the atmosphere more quickly than at any other time in the entirety of Earth history over the past 4.5 billion years. And that's truly saying something when you know just how dramatic transformations Earth has gone through.
And over what time scales too? This is like in an eye blink we're doing this.
Exactly. And that's the thing. It's the combined speed and scale of our changes that really stand out, that make our influence so outsized. No other species before us has changed the planet and changed so many layers of the planet so quickly. The oxygenation of Earth is certainly as profound, if not more profound, than what's happening right now. But that was an incredibly gradual process compared to fossil fuel driven climate change.
Yeah. And even, I mean, what a profound topic. I feel like we just have to take a breath and like breathe on that. But even going back to what you just mentioned about, this sort of extraction of these incredibly energy rich, dead organisms, for lack of a better way to describe that. I think about this fact that like this is a zero sum game. Like that will never happen again, not to the extent that we are extracting billions of years of life. We're not extracting 10,000 years of life. And so the more that we take, the less that there is. And like you mentioned about the carbon cycle, right? When it's sequestered, the climate cools. When it's, released into the atmosphere, the climate warms. Even beyond that very simple calculus, when we use this stuff, there's less in the future. And that also, this kind of like genie out of the bottle phenomenon is really profound. You mentioned it's meant to be there. And then you sort of qualified, which I think was so important. Like, not because there's some sort of plan, right? There's no intentionality here. Nobody designed it to be this way. But when it's no longer in situ, when it's no longer held in the place, the layer, the mix that it naturally deposited over billions of years, the entire system is dramatically transformed. And we don't know what that means for a system to sort of unleash the energy of a spring into it. Everything changes at that point in ways that are like, even our best models can't really predict.
And that's one of, the truly most terrifying aspects of anthropogenic climate change, is that there is so much that is unknown. I mean, right now, scientists are even seriously questioning whether we have already tipped the climate, into a new state. And is that the reason for, this, what seems like this accelerated rate of sea temperature increase and such?
Right, like a runaway effect.
Right. Or is it just a multi-year blip, and then things are going to, continue on a more expected trend after that? There's so many complex feedbacks that, it's impossible to precisely predict them. And because this has never happened before, not only in human history, but potentially in the entire history of the planet, we don't have any precedent to rely on. And so all of those unknowns are just, it's so scary to contemplate that, that we are really pushing ourselves. What we know is already bad enough, but then to be pushing ourselves into, even unknown territory beyond that is so much worse.
So I'm curious then, kind of coming around full circle to your experience sitting down to report on this book, to write it, to put all of this research and all of the insights and sort of the paradigm shifts that occurred within you as you began to think about these things in new and exciting ways. The detached scientist journalist who looks at these fascinating phenomena and tells these stories from a position separate than them is maybe a happy scientist journalist, or at least one with a neutral mood. But the minute that we really start to introspect and reflect in a major way, and that sort of realization creeps up that, like, uh-oh, I'm a part of this story. This is not a story I'm reporting on from outside. This is my environment, and this is my reality, and that of everything and everyone I ever loved. It is that of the planet of which I am inextricably linked. How do you handle the existential dread that comes from that, Ferris?
Yeah, I do find myself toggling or even careening between very different emotional states that have
Mhm.
come out of this kind of research because, so going back to that idea of all life being an extension of Earth, so I really have come to see myself and all of us as this literal extension of the planet. And when I think of what we are doing to the overall system and how it comes back to harm not only us, but countless non-human species, and then, of course, all of our future generations, it is so difficult not to be overwhelmed with this mix of, anger and despair, and
Mhm.
then but then this research also requires you to take this completely inhuman, geologic, cosmic perspective, to
Yeah.
contemplate billions upon billions of years. And I do find a kind of solace in this. And I think that a lot of geoscientists and related thinkers have talked about this, that when you are forced to take that perspective, I keep coming back to the incredible resilience of the Earth system as a whole. I mean, we can't escape the fact that Earth has been alive for something like 4 billion years and has remained alive that whole time. Now, of course, that involves, repeated catastrophes and the loss of most extant species at the time in each one of those catastrophes. So it's no consolation for any individual species or
Yeah.
civilization, but it's more of a planetary level solace that this Earth system we inhabit and are just a small part of is an astonishingly resilient and beautiful and complex entity. And that there's just something I just find, a certain kind of faith in the Earth as a whole is going to keep going. It's going to take a lot to completely kill the planet. I don't know what is in store for humanity in our future. But I think that some people, they have concerns about the planet as a whole, being completely annihilated or obliterated or dying. And I think that's going to be really, really difficult to act for a planet to actually reach that point.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think obviously there's going to be a point cosmically where that happens because of, like, like these larger planetary dynamics, but from within, I would agree with that. And that's why I sometimes think it's funny when I'm watching Hollywood portrayals of, like, that are set in post-apocalyptic eras, and you see these huge geologic shifts, and these huge kind of environmental shifts, and you're like, we would not still be there. Like, we would not be the characters in this play.
Right.
Definitely not. But that takes us back to that weird concept, though, of ingenuity and technology and, this sort of human capability to build things that, like, for our survival to become, in our narrow and anthropocentric view, more important than the survival of anything and everything else. And, well, I'll just make a machine for that. And that's kind of a really interesting approach that we have, and I think one that contributes to this devastating feedback loop.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think grappling with all of this, reckoning with all of this also forces one to realize, to accept that in a way we always inhabit a world of both wonder and horror. They've always been simultaneous. And it is equally misguided to fixate on one over the other. Living kind of requires you to embrace both. So it is a time of horrific wildfires, and yet that doesn't erase the existence of the flowers that are dependent on fires to bloom and to exist at all. You know what I mean? Like there's both the miracle of life and the horrors of what we've done to the planet are still coexisting. And I think that is what, in some ways, we are fighting, or should be fighting even harder to save, right? Is to preserve that incredible, beauty and complexity and wonder, and really just the miracle that life is, that any of this exists at all, that any of this happened at all, right? That this incredible
Yeah.
chain of events even began in the first place.
It's so, so funny. I feel like here in these last few minutes, the thing that I hate it because it's a shift. It's a little bit of a shift away. But again, thinking about those parallels, and it's my show, damn it. So I'm going to do what I want to do. But I think about the work, again, that I do as an existentially oriented psychologist, that very often when I'm working with patients, especially patients who are dealing with a lot of issues around mortality and big questions about meaning and purpose and death and all of these things, we often get into the existential. And one of the fundamental kind of tenets of a lot of existential theory, thought, and practice is that it's too much to bear. Like that literally life is deeply full of suffering and incredibly anxiety inducing and overwhelming. And many theorists will call that sort of being in the ontologic mode or being in the existential mode. But then our brains don't let us stay there for that long in that sheer kind of contemplative terror. We are then brought out into what we call the normal mode of being, where we start watching bullshit reality TV and we buy things on Amazon, and we get back into these like rhythms of distraction, and we go back and forth and back and forth. And that balance is what allows us to both handle the heaviness of all of the unbearable, lightness of being, but also the absurdity and the joy. And I cannot help but see a parallel with what you just said about that balance between, fire that wipes out an entire ecosystem, but then allows something else to thrive in its place. It can't be one without the other.
Yeah, I love that idea of the necessity of moving between very different modes of thinking, very different intellectual spaces. That really resonates with me. And I spent so much time in this project moving between very different realms, moving between the microscopic and the planetary, and trying to connect them, between the human and the non-human, and trying to connect them. But I think we're seeing, it sounds so trite in some way, but it's like the importance of connections themselves has been such a powerful theme in ecological thinking and recent books about ecology. Entanglement, connection, intertwining. And I think that's in part because the current planetary crisis is forcing us to realize the importance of such connections. They've always been there, but they're kind of glowing or searing with renewed importance right now.
And they require a shift in the type of thinking that generally comes easy. And I don't know if that's fundamentally neurological or if it's deeply socialized, but as a species, we really like black and white thinking. We really like clarity and certainty. But what you're talking about is like the definition of interconnectivity is being in the ambivalent space. It's being in the in-between and saying, no, I'm not here and I'm not there. I'm both and I'm neither. And that is a deeply, profoundly threatening experience to a lot of people. But just like in my work as a psychologist, and just like in your work doing the reporting on this book, if we allow ourselves to exist in that sort of liminal space, we allow ourselves to see suffering and beauty at the same time. And I think we allow ourselves to have a more authentic relationship to life.
Right. And I think that it's often in the in-between spaces and also at the extremes of things that we often come to our greatest insights. I think one of the reasons there's been a lot of resistance within mainstream science to thinking of anything outside the level of the cell or the organism as alive is that a lot of scientists do not want to conflate a ecosystem or a planet with an organism. And it gets to this whole controversy, this whole history surrounding the idea of a superorganism. And I totally understand that because, an organism as defined today it's not identical to an ecosystem. I personally don't think of Earth as an organism, even though that's some way that people have interpreted this whole idea of Gaia or a living planet over time. I think that we have to recognize that life is a multi-scalar phenomenon. It happens at different scales, and it's not identical at each of those scales, but it rhymes at each of those scales, that there will be resonance between each of them. And so I can't really say any logical reason to say, no, viruses and anything below the cell is not alive, and anything above the organism is not alive. I think we need to look at that whole spectrum from, virus, cell, organism, population, ecosystem, planet, and recognize that the phenomenon we call life emerges at each of those scales and will be similar in some ways, but not exactly the same at each of them.
And so what I take away from what you just said is that there is a way for us to fully embrace these views without being pseudoscientific and woo-woo. Like, we can have it both ways. We can see this in a very deeply scientific way, but it can still resonate with us in this kind of complex and meaningful and profound way without having to make these wild leaps or make these claims that tend into the woo.
Exactly. I mean, I think the fact that life has profoundly changed the planet is now a well accepted and extremely well supported fact. And this concept or framework viewpoint of seeing Earth as a vast interconnected living system is gaining acceptance. That's the conclusion I've come to. While it remains provocative to just plainly state Earth is alive, there is, I believe, a meaningful statement. There is a scientific way to approach and to look at that. Absolutely. Yeah. I think that, so much of these ancient insights and intuitions and beliefs are, now being echoed by the most recent scientific thinking.
I love it. Well, gosh, I feel like that is such a good kind of stopping point, even though we could go on forever. This was a really inspiring and like motivating conversation for me. And I hope that the folks who are listening kind of feel the same way. Maybe this feels like one of those episodes that we might want to go back and listen to again because there's so much there, and maybe it'll inspire some really interesting debates and conversations within your own lives. So everybody, the book is Becoming Earth: How Our Planet Came to Life by Ferris Jabr. Thank you so much, Ferris, for being on the show, for doing this important work, and also for kind of tickling us intellectually today.
No, thank you. It's my pleasure.
And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.